Hello and warm welcome to this exciting live webinar titled Maximizing Efficiency and Security by Adopting the SASE Framework, brought to you by ETCIO and McAfee. I am Shashwat DC, Consulting Editor, ETCIO. From an enterprise perspective, we seem to be living in exciting times. In fact, if we were to paraphrase Charles Dickens, we seem to be living in the best of times and the worst of times. On one hand, we seem to have seamlessly transitioned into a seamless workflow wherein people working from offices and home seem to be doing so in perfect tandem. On the other hand, the spread of the networking infrastructure has increased the threats of cybersecurity attacks on network infrastructure. In fact, cybersecurity issues are becoming a day-to-day struggle for businesses. Recent trends and statistics indicate that the threats of cybersecurity attacks has increased manifold and seem to be emanating from everyday devices like the laptops, mobiles, or IoT devices. So how can we secure the entire landscape without having to compromise on productivity? This is where SASE, or Secure Access Service Edge, comes into play. This is a new paradigm in the manner security is envisaged and adopted. In fact, SASE was first defined in 2019 by Gartner in its Hype Cycle for Enterprise Networking report. To help us better understand how SASE works, what are the challenges, what are the benefits, what are the applications, we have with us Vamsi Panakanti, Head of Technical Sales, India and SAP, McAfee. Before I hand over the reins to Vamsi, I would like to remind our viewers that they can pose their questions in the chat while the session is on, and we would take them at the end of the session in a Q&A or have them answered by the experts. Over to you, Vamsi.
Very glad to participate in this discussion and give our thoughts from a McAfee perspective on how essentially we look at SASE and how do we address some of the security paradigm from a SASE perspective. I have a few slides to share and speak about SASE, but before I do that, I wanted to establish the reason for why SASE is prevalent and why we think it is important for organizations to adopt a framework. While SASE is specific to Gartner, there are frameworks which are making it easy for services and products to be delivered over the cloud. And it is an imperative need right now, given how the world has changed over the last 4 years. So if you look at how traditionally IT environments have been structured, there were a bunch of applications, there was a lot of investments made into infrastructure, a lot of investments made into building applications that were hosted in data centers, and they were delivered and people were consuming them. So it would be your clients, it could be consumers, and everybody was consuming them in a manner that was best suited at that time. But over the last several years, and particularly so over the last 6 months, we've seen that there was a need for a breakout direct to the internet, which meant that architectures had to be reimagined. You had to relook at how applications were delivered from an IT and a computer landscape. And that has actually brought to the forefront some of these frameworks. At the very basic level, if you look at what SASE does, it kind of brings in networking and security together to the edge. Now, there were different paradigms, different teams should do this. In the past, somebody would take care of the entire networking piece, and security would be taken care of from a policy perspective, typically by the CISO organization and the operations team from somewhere else. This is the beauty of where networking and security is coming together, and that's what SASE is essentially helping us provide networking and security from the edge directly over the internet and make consumption of IT over the edge that much more easier. That's what SASE does. All right, if you can see my screen, what we're going to speak about from a SASE perspective is how McAfee approaches this particular problem statement. McAfee has this very exciting strategy and roadmap and vision that we call as the MVISION for all of our capabilities, all of our platform security services delivered directly from the cloud to be consumed by organizations across the globe. This portfolio of our solutions is essentially called as the MVISION, and we have a bunch of capabilities that we provide over this MVISION portfolio. The most recent one and the most exciting one where we bring in a bunch of our capabilities together is called as the Unified Cloud Edge. So if you look at what are some of the market trends, there's a need, as we spoke about, there's a need over the last several years, but more recently over the last few months, particularly about services and applications to actually break out directly to the internet. There's also a big shift of all the applications to the cloud, and there's a variety of devices that are actually accessing these applications that are delivered directly from the internet, from the cloud, for different aspects of consumers, employees, vendors, and even complex solutions that are being provided from that perspective. And not to mention that today the user is a 24-hour user, which means that the user is all over the world. They can be at a coffee shop, they can be in a public space, they can be at an airport sitting and consuming some of the corporate applications, and that's where the workforce is that much more mobile. And these are some of the market trends that actually define how services are getting consumed today. If you then look at what are some of the challenges that this brings to the forefront, the number one question that we ask is, how do I increase my security posture, or how do I keep my security posture optimum without increasing complexity? You know, the one thing that we've always heard from a traditional security conversation is, oh, you know, every time there is a security aspect, it kind of brings in a complexity to the architecture from an application perspective. And so the number one priority is, how do I improve my posture without increasing the complexity? The second thing is, how do I ensure that we continue to be protected and we continue to fall under the overall compliance and regulatory initiatives with all the users and the data moving everywhere around the globe? And the third aspect essentially is, how do I enable cloud workspaces to increase productivity and still secure sensitive data, right? So all relevant challenges, any new service that is provided over the internet will essentially face some of these challenges. So what we'll speak about is how do we address some of these key challenges over the next 20-25 minutes. So the current methodology for data security, if you look at it, essentially there are 4 different control points. You've got the device, then you've got the network over which that particular device connects. You've got the open internet, and then finally the cloud, which is the new paradigm from an internet delivery perspective. So if you look at that, the traditional on-prem data leakage prevention solutions used to provide security for data essentially on the endpoint and then the network, because we were much more in control of our perimeter. We were much more in control of where the data itself is traversing. But with increased adoption of web-based applications and cloud-based applications, or if you're building your own applications up in the cloud, what is happening is there is a certain gap that is generated out of this. And that gap is when I move my data from my corporate environment and that goes to an internet or it goes to a corporate hosted application in the cloud, how do I bring about the visibility or control that data when it goes up in the cloud? And that remains to be a gap. The second gap that we see is, even from a traditional approach from a data leakage perspective, what happens when the user goes out of the premises? What if they take a corporate asset? And we've seen multiple different facets of those assets now. It could be a BYOD, it could be a unmanaged device because you want to open up some of your applications like email and maybe some other productive applications from an employee perspective. And it could also be your corporate device, which is a managed device, but somebody is connecting through it from an unmanaged location, from an unmanaged network. So there's a combination of what we do at the device and the data, but there's also some things that are blind spots, essentially the gaps that we're speaking about, is how do you then look for that particular data and also protect that device and the user while they connect and transact with that data over the web. And this is where the gap essentially comes in. So you've got traditional data leakage solutions that were protecting at the endpoint and in the network. You've got the new age cloud security solutions, often known as cloud access security brokers, which were providing visibility into the web and at the cloud layer. But the combination of these two is where the largest gaps have been. And what we essentially to try to do with this from the current methodology is to try and fix those gaps, fix those blind spots and move outside of that. The other main important challenge and the main gap that we do not speak about is when you've got two distinct solutions that are doing it in a manner, one on the cloud and one on the endpoint or on the network, is that there's no uniformity when it comes to policy, no common way of enforcing this particular policy when it comes in. All this adds complexity. It continues to keep gaps. And as the gaps become more evident to a wrong player, it becomes easier for us to be able to exploit that. And not to mention, of course, the overall cost of ownership to be able to manage and administer all these different solutions differently. How do we solve this problem, right? This is a new approach. So what we call, like I said, on the MVISION portfolio, which is everything delivered from the cloud, we're trying to bring in a concept of bringing everything that we just spoke about delivered through an edge, delivered at the internet, at a point where it can actually give the visibility to the data and what is happening on the cloud. So the unified cloud edge essentially provides the following capabilities. It brings you the ability to have common policies and insights for data and for access, whether it is on the endpoint or in the cloud. What it's also doing is it's actually merging business risk and threat database. What do I mean by that? What happens if you have the ability to see a threat or a malicious act that is happening on your device and be able to correlate that on what it is essentially trying to do? The most important being, is it trying to even lock me out of my system, ask me for potential ransomware, or is it trying to exfiltrate and steal some of that data? And when you look at that, it becomes a very powerful use case to have an end-to-end visibility of how business risk is actually tied to a threat. The operational and the administrative aspect is also simplified. So there are unified incidents, there are unified workflows, so I can actually remediate an incident, whether it is a data leakage incident or providing access to a certain application over the cloud with so much ease at the click of a single button over a single management console. Closed loop remediation, I just spoke about it. So if you have some sort of a leakage that you see, or if you see an incident that's popped up as a result of unwanted data being seen up there in the cloud, how do you close that remediation loop across your entire enterprise architecture? And of course, some of the beauty of these new age cloud capabilities is, imagine if you were using a cloud service from a Microsoft or from a Google or from somebody else, and they have the same cloud essentially. So Microsoft does not differentiate between a home user who wants to tie up for a home version of Office 365 versus a corporate user like us who wants a corporate instance of Office 365. Both of us are Office 365 users, which means everything is available over the internet. Organizations will still have a lot of interest in trying to be able to restrict such kind of access. So if I am a corporate, I'd want my tenant to be accessible only by my users and not by anybody who's got access to Office 365. So that is also possible in terms of being able to restrict that tenancy, restrict the access to that tenancy. And finally, the complete context awareness, right? So you'll have the visibility of whether it is a packet of data moving in from your device all the way to the cloud, or whether it is a threat that you see in the cloud and it has potential implications of it back on your device. Moving on, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes. I know it's a busy slide, but I didn't really want to leave without mentioning how unified cloud edge comes into the SASE convergence. As I spoke at the beginning, the SASE model or the SASE convergence model brings in a concept of network and security together. We've got traditional networking, whether it is connecting to the edge, connecting to the cloud, optimization capabilities, etc. And on the other hand, you had a bunch of security investments from the network perspective, whether it is IPS, whether it is zero trust access, or whether it is web access or firewall as a service and DNS security and so on. So SASE essentially helps you bring all of this and provided modular service manner directly from the edge, and that's where the secure access server edge actually becomes the most important aspect of it. And this convergence is what SASE essentially solves. And now, how does McAfee play in the overall SASE convergence space? Is McAfee is the first and only vendor to fully converge the CASB, DLP, and the web. That's a very powerful combination. There are common insights across the portfolio, which provides very detailed context of the data of the threat. There's also the ability to consistently manage policies across all the control points that we spoke about, whether it is the endpoint, the network, or the cloud. We can also secure access to cloud applications. To that extent, it could also be possible that if you have an application that is published on the cloud and is able to accept connections and provide access to all the users over the cloud, you'll still be able to restrict it based on the kind of devices that come in. So you could also put in a certain amount of posture checks. You could also put in a certain amount of sanity into what kind of devices are coming in, so you don't bring the threat from the device into the cloud-based application. Obviously, it is very cost-effective because you're trying to converge a bunch of capabilities together, which means that there is a unification from an administrator and a policy perspective. And of course, you can deploy modular additional SASE elements using a partner ecosystem that essentially brings together capabilities for you to plug in a firewall investment that's already made or a zero trust investment that you've already made. So that's how we actually help improve the overall security from an edge perspective. If you see how UC evolves the overall security posture, I'd like to speak about four distinct points. The first one being from a data perspective. So if you look at data, data is everywhere. However, the unification of this data protection across the endpoint, web, and cloud services brings together the beauty of having a singular visibility as well as a remediation opportunity from a data perspective. Some of the example features are unified DLP and CASB classifications. So if you've got a classification strategy that is already defined and you've got it deployed or you've got it already in place, in either of these, whether it is on the endpoint or in the cloud, it's extensible, it is scalable directly to your entire data protection across wherever that data resides. The second aspect is the web and the cloud threats. You're looking at threat protection in a uniform manner across the control points that we just spoke about, endpoint, as well as the web, as well as the cloud services. So that's where the beauty comes in. When you see a threat and you see the impact of that threat, and the threat has behavioral parameters that it shows that it could go and manipulate, say, a PowerShell that is essentially found on an endpoint device, you'll be able to share that visibility. You'll be able to look at that threat from a holistic perspective and kind of have a risk-based policy, and also have some, from an overall IT perspective, shadow policies defined to be able to control that. The third aspect is how do remote users actually connect to the cloud? The last 4 or 5 months have essentially shown us that people have to work from anywhere. People have to have the ability to continue to run their business from anywhere, and this is what this provides. You'll have the ability to secure the device and direct to cloud connectivity from these remote users from wherever they are. Yeah. So you can essentially have a managed device through a secure tunnel connecting to the web and looking at all the data and the threats in a bidirectional manner, and also extend it to some of the mobile devices. And of course, if you also have some of your remote sites, this is not just from a user perspective. If you've got smaller locations of offices that do not necessarily have to have an investment from a VPN or an MPLS infrastructure, but can actually break out directly to the internet, that is also a possibility now with bringing together of the web, the DLP, and the CASB aspects together. And there are immense possibilities from an overall integration perspective. So everything could be directly at the edge. The cost of infra, the cost of architecture, which we saw traditionally in the past, could be deployed smartly in a much more efficient manner. And that's where it brings in the overall efficiency and security to the environment. Of course, all of this is backed by a scalable architecture that is infinitely scalable and also resilient by design and resilient by nature. So there's never the worry of downtime. In fact, McAfee goes as far as claiming 5 nines of service availability. It is a service level agreement that we actually provide. And the architecture from a multi-point of presence across the globe ensures that we provide it with the least amount of latency possible. Moving on, one of the use cases that we speak about, like I said, is how do you democratize data? How do you make your data work for you? And how do you actually make sure that you provide security to that data and not necessarily locking down your business? So that's one of the most important use cases this particular capability solves. So from a unified management and simply a single management location, you can have a variety of controls that are already put in place. If you look at the administration console, it's a single login capability that you can have for the web, the cloud, as well as the data leakage perspective. You log in once, and you should not be able to have any opacity when it comes to understanding of how these services work. It's a very transparent way of providing services across DLP, web protection, and the cloud security. The policy definition is also incredibly simple because you've got a single place of visibility of how the data or the threat moves. You're able to define a singular policy and have a singular way of approaching the remediation as well as the application of this particular security policy from an enforcement perspective. So if you see data moving aside from your endpoint all the way to the cloud and you see that it's not been classified, the policy definition could actually take care of that. And of course, one aspect is the visibility. The second aspect is, of course, the classification. The third aspect then speaks about the enforcement from a unified perspective. How do you apply all these policies that have just been defined and continue to push for data leakage or for threat protection consistently across all these control points? And that's where the unified enforcement actually comes together. You'll have a single enforcement vector across all different data protection vectors. And from an operations perspective, when you then look at it, if I have a bunch of incidents that come in, having to feed incidents separately from your DLP engine, having to feed incidents separately from your web security investment that you've already made, and most importantly, any incidents that you see from your cloud space, having to manually correlate them, feed them into a different location, having to correlate that and analyze that and come to actionable intelligence. That is the other most important aspect that this actually solves. So unified incident management capability, where through one console, all data protection incidents and the reporting can essentially be solved. The second use case after making your data more accessible is stopping advanced web and cloud-based threats. So if you look at how these threats come in, these days when you look at it, the internet or the web vector is by far, I think, either the first or the second most commonly misused vector to deliver payloads, to deliver malicious activity that is happening on your environments. And when you then look at it, there has to be a continuous way of looking at threats. There has to be layered defense that provides real-time protection. So the emulation technologies that are built into these capabilities kind of reduces the overall threats that ultimately you have to solve closer to the device and closer to the user. So what happens is, if you then look at it, this is like a funnel, the largest being at the front of the mouth, where there's a bunch of technologies that includes categorization. You look at the reputation of the website, you look at the reputation of the files, the reputation of content that is being delivered. There is also intelligence and behavior analytics built into understanding the geolocation, any dynamic IP addresses, etc. All that comes in, and a bunch of engines that run in from that particular perspective of anti-malware, or you're looking at behaviorally different kind of files, all that flowing through the front part of the engine. And you essentially are able to filter out nearly 80% of your traffic, with only the 20% of additional traffic having to go through closer to your environment, closer to your user, and closer to your device. But that's not it. How do you then evolve and try and reduce the number of incidents that need to be triaged and looked at? How do you make sure that you only look at the most prioritized and the most important incidents that actually impact your environment? That's where the emulation sandbox actually comes in. So what you try to do is you actually try and simulate the environment for any payloads that are potentially malicious to be able to run in an environment and come and arrive at some sort of a definition around that. Is that potentially exploitable? Is it a high degree of potentially exploitable? If I send it over to my device that's actually consuming this particular data piece, can it impact my entire environment? And that's where the real-time emulation actually comes in. Previously unknown threats are also analyzed here from a behavioral perspective, and you filter out an additional 19.5% of threats roughly that actually go through all the way to the end user, so they don't really receive any malicious data. But that's not where we solve. Typical vendors may stop there, but then the most impactful and the ones that cause the most harm are the at least 0.5% or 1% of threats that actually manage to creep in. So we've got a way to even stop that. We look at that also as eliminating the threat surface as much as possible from the end user and the end user's device. So this is where the remote browser isolation actually comes in, which can kind of containerize all of that data that you're trying to access over the web in a remote disposable environment, so it doesn't ever reach the end device when you don't know that it is a safe amount of traffic that's coming in. So for all the unknown traffic, and this is by definition you could do, unknown traffic or uncategorized traffic or potentially risky traffic can be containerized and shown in a remote browser instance where you're able to kind of just stream data and reduce the interactivity from that data. So even if there is that 0.5% of malicious activity creeping through, it will never touch the device. So you're kind of still keeping the device and the user that much safer, even if there's that minuscule chance of something creeping through. And this is where the remaining 0.5% are detected. Now, this is defense in depth, defense in layers. Obviously, this is a journey, and we've seen that as customers mature through their overall threat cycle, they understand the need for additional investments into going through this, and a well coordinated solution that brings in the data and the threat capabilities together actually helps us solve the data problem as well as the threat problem that much more effectively. While we look at everything from a web perspective, it is not just restricted to that. How do you extend it and take it to a cloud security as well? So how about cloud native management and advanced threat protection directly to the cloud, right? So you've got the endpoints and you've got your cloud-based applications, or you've got your SaaS and PaaS instances where you've got some of your applications running or you're consuming services from a SaaS application. the endpoints are still going to access through that. And that's where the unified cloud edge actually comes in. It is, think of it as a co-located data center somewhere up in the cloud, which brings in the best of the CASB capabilities as well as the next generation secure web gateway and also a remote browser isolation capability all together delivered as a service in a highly scalable and with an SLA driven kind of an environment. So what this provides is, it gives you the ability to have granular control for shadow IT. And why is it important? Imagine in today's world when more and more users are working remotely and you have to provide them access because they have to continue to run corporate instances, but they also have to run some applications that are not necessarily from a corporate perspective. The threat surface remains vulnerable because the endpoints are the same. You should also be able to identify any shadow IT, which is IT or compute assets that you're not essentially aware of if any of your employees are actually using that. And that's the visibility into shadow IT gives you first visibility and the ability to then control that data or IT that much more effectively. So it allows user to download files from Dropbox. For example, if you have somebody who's in a vendor-based environment, but they have to interact with vendors where they'll be able to download documents and review some contracts that come in, but you should never be able to upload a document there. That's one use case. Now, even if you were to upload a document there because it's a bidirectional use case that you have, you'd still be in a position where you'd want to look at that data and make sure that that data that is being uploaded to that cloud instance does not violate a data protection policy. That's where granularity actually comes in. So I'll still allow a download from a shared public cloud application and also a potential upload, but I will not allow a data violation to actually happen. And that's the beauty of the web as well as the cloud and the DLP capabilities coming together. The second thing is, there's another use case where users are allowed to add comments and view profiles on LinkedIn, but cannot upload anything there. So it's very easy if you were using a Facebook or if you're using a LinkedIn. These days, it's possible for user to be interactive on those channels as well. You can actually upload a document on a LinkedIn messaging platform or in a Facebook comment stuff, and you'll have that granularity to be able to prevent as well. There's a bunch of other use cases that I mentioned on the screen. I don't want to read about every one of those, but essentially this is where we're bringing the overall business risk and the threat together to be able to provide that visibility, both in terms of threat as well as protection of a data perspective. The third and the most important use case, we spoke about remote users, we spoke about applications that are delivered over the cloud, SaaS applications, etc. The third and the most important use case, again, is these days enabling remote workforce. Like we said, we've got a bunch of users now working from anywhere. Increasingly, business models, particularly in finance and insurance and manufacturing, is all about feet on street, users being sent to tier 2, tier 3 cities, and that will be increasingly that much more normal. And you can't expect a smaller office to be deployed or set up in every one of these locations. So how do you still have that level of security, have that level of virtual office with the visibility and still control all of the data and the threats at the same time, make it that much more nimble, make it that much more friendly for people to be able to work from anywhere. And this is where the concept of remote users actually comes in. You can use some of the capabilities to even enable corporate workloads directly to be accessible from an unmanaged device as well. So if you were to say quickly onboard a bunch of sales people that are in a tier 3 city in India, you can still do that. You can ask them to bring their own device. You can ask them to go and sign up to this particular service directly over a cloud, and everything else at the back end is directed through that cloud service. So everything is going through the McAfee MVISION cloud service, where you'd have the web gateway cloud service. You've got the DLP capabilities from CASB. At the same time, with the bidirectional threat intelligence, if there's any threat, as a matter of fact, any malicious data that is going in from that unmanaged device, potentially hitting a sensitive application that is hosted in the cloud, you'll still be able to look for malware, scan that particular piece of traffic that is going in there and prevent any malicious traffic from reaching cloud applications with sensitive data in there. And this is where it brings in all these capabilities together. Finally, reducing complexity and increasing scalability. That's not particularly a use case that people really pay a lot of attention to, but it is important while you look at it in a traditional world. If you were to deploy use cases essentially or security paradigms essentially for enabling remote workforce, you'd have a bunch of technologies like VPN, DMZ setups and all of that to expose your applications and allow people to log in from there and access those applications. However, when you bring in all of that to the edge, you bring in the concept of networking, you bring in the concept of security directly to the edge, you're able to provide these as microservices directly from the edge. So you can look at web traffic, you can look at data that is traversing, and you could also essentially look at threats that are traversing forward and backward and reduce the overall complexity and increase the scalability. How do you increase scalability? Because this is just a service that needs to be extended to any set of new users. You just provision that service to a new user and they can immediately be productive from an edge perspective. Moving on, I just wanted to also touch upon, while we spoke a lot about a unified cloud edge and what happens essentially at the edge perspective, the next thing is why McAfee? And you look at McAfee, it's got one of the most unique propositions from a security perspective. It's the only organization or information security organization that looks at the cyber defense platform in a holistic manner. McAfee is a true security platform that brings in everything from the device to the cloud as a set of services or as a set of capabilities that can be deployed on your premises. And the MVISION portfolio essentially brings in everything from the endpoint protection to the advanced use cases around endpoint detection and response, and also threat intelligence, particularly based on these endpoints. What are they interacting with some new capabilities we added, such as MVISION Insights, and extend that to the web controls using a combination of the DLP, the remote browser isolation, the web gateway capabilities, and CASB capabilities over the unified cloud edge. And of course, securing the cloud infrastructure, not just from a data perspective, which is what most CASB vendors might do, but extending it towards the left of the cloud infrastructure. If you're in a continuous integration, continuous development kind of a model, you'll still be able to extend your overall security and look at vulnerabilities and posture of the cloud applications in real time. But that's for another session. The focus is around essentially unified cloud edge. The analytics and intelligence engine and the insights that we get across all of these different vectors is common and it is shared. And that's where we have nearly 2 billion sensors related data coming in and feeding a lot of this data back into our global threat intelligence that essentially helps us keep the world and organizations safe and secure around. To summarize, here are some of the reasons why McAfee's MVISION Unified Cloud Edge makes more sense. We've already spoke about a bunch of these, but the top being common policies and insights across endpoint, web, and cloud. You have the ability to merge business risk and as well as the threat databases. So you have continuous visibility of threats as well as data across. There's a unified incident management and workflow from a remediation perspective. So one incident reports across all the control points that we spoke about. There's a closed loop remediation. What I see on an endpoint device, I can essentially control what kind of data leakage could potentially happen over my cloud, over a heterogeneous cloud environment, whether it is an Amazon or a Dropbox. We could have the ability to restrict tenants from a corporate tenant to a private tenant where there's no cross-pollination of data, there's no contamination of data that actually happens. And then, of course, the most important aspect, again, is the complete context awareness. The more context I have, the better I am prepared to be able to deal with that. And supported by some of the best service availability. And if you look at some of the data, this is public on trust.mcafee.com, nearly 5 nines of service availability, and you'll be able to see how we've been performing over a period of time. If you look at the McAfee Eye, as we call it, or what McAfee can see because of their global presence, because of the phenomenal presence that we have across the world, we see nearly about 316 new threats that are previously unknown. And we use that intelligence to feed it back and protect your devices, protect your cloud services, and protect your data whichever way it flows. It is completely aligning with the architectural model of SASE and extensible with a ZTNA network. For those of you who wonder what ZTNA is, it's the Zero Trust Network Access. So you could look at a combination of providing inbound access as well as outbound web access or cloud access, essentially, and these are extensible frameworks from an architecture perspective, and this plugs in very nicely into an extension of ZTNA or the core SASE framework. And of course, if you look at what brings the best of these three things together, these are all market leading and the best of breed technologies. They've been recommended by some of the analysts continuously for several years in a row. the DLP, the web gateway, as well as the CASB capabilities from McAfee are the best in class, and you're bringing the best of these three together to form a capability on the MVISION Unified Cloud Edge as being the foremost service as a combination of these three. Just a reflection of how superior all these capabilities are. If you look at, just this year in 2020, most of the customers that use these solutions across the globe have given us very, very high rating, and we're very proud about that. I've already spoken about this. Again, a representation of what McAfee can see owing to its global threat intelligence, nearly 316 zero-day threats every minute, and the largest cybersecurity threat research team anywhere in the globe, nearly about a million or over a million samples research per day, and of course the intelligence network that brings in nearly 50 billion queries per day to the McAfee GTI and continues to keep corporates and people and consumers across the globe safe and secure. I think with that, we come to the end of my presentation. Just to summarize once again, what does McAfee MVISION Unified Cloud Edge help us with? Comprehensive data protection from device to the cloud. It brings about the convergence of cloud data, threat, and web security together. It is a cloud-native architecture that is infinitely scalable and built in with resilience at the same time. And the adoption is easy because all of this is delivered as a service directly over the edge. If you need to find out more information, you can go to mcafee.com/unified cloud. Of course, we're happy to take a few questions at this point in time. That brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. In fact, you had a very comprehensive take on the manner in which this SASE framework can help organizations become more secure, and especially in context on how McAfee has solutions which map to the framework. Look, I like the fact that you spoke about how we can democratize data, how we can secure it, and how we can also ensure reduce complexity and that kind of. But there's one important aspect that I think there are a lot of questions flowing on from our viewers. One of the question that keeps coming up often, and even Shrikant Batula has asked this thing. So there's a question for you. What are the performance overheads in adopting SASE framework vis-a-vis corporate perimeter infrastructure?
Okay, Shrikant, great question. So if you look at it, this is not one central internet breakout point anymore, right? The beauty of SASE is being able to serve wherever users are. If you're in a corporate environment, great. Most organizations may have invested in an MPLS kind of an environment where there's internet breakouts, but what SASE allows you to do is kind of distribute that internet breakouts as well, right? Today, I can use my home-based DSL or broadband connection, or even a mobile-based data connection, and I can still access corporate networks and be able to go about my daily productive stuff. And there's really no organizational investment for me to be able to connect over the internet to my cloud services. So to that end, there's really no operational/infra requirements that this brings in as an overhead. So the breakout to the internet is from wherever you have internet access. Great. If you have a corporate provided internet, it just runs the same way it is. If you're on a home broadband connection, you'll still be able to get the same level of security through this. And the distribution is what makes it that much more powerful. You're bringing in multiple points of access directly to break out to the cloud. So you're no longer restricted to choke points like you would in a typical data center kind of a world where all of these are coming to a choke point and have to traverse through that choke point.
You have spoken about how McVision, UC log kind of brings various capabilities info. What we also wanted, there's one question which came up is, how can McVision UC log and block files based on specific file metadata, classification labels being uploaded to risky cloud applications like, WeTransfer, PDF converter, etc.
So it's a fairly comprehensive question. I'll also try and answer it as much as possible. There are a combination of factors. So we spoke about sensitive data being, uploaded to a WeTransfer or whatever. So these are extension of traditional data prevention policies. So most organizations, if you don't, it's important and it is imperative for organizations to first understand your data, classify your data, and have a data prevention policy that is in place. So your sensitive data never leaves the organization and goes somewhere else. What this service does is it brings together your data prevention capabilities. It brings in the web prevention. So if you're accessing, say, a website over a particular channel, and there is a categorization typically that organizations rely on whether or not to allow that website to be accessible to users within the environment. Those will continue to remain. What this is only doing is it's kind of bringing all of this together in a cloud-based singular service. So we'd still rely on categorization of websites, we'd still look at the risk profile of this particular website, we'd still look at classification of the data, we'll still look at the the DLP policy itself if it is violating. And finally, what we also do is, like I said, anything that is related to a threat or a cloud service or a website, all of this feeds into our global threat intelligence. So every point there is an access that is happening, except from the data prevention from a threat perspective, we look up back to the global threat intelligence to see, is the source the right thing? Is it a malicious endpoint that has previously been known to cause infections? Is it a bad website where there are some payloads? Or is it a cloud service that has been previously known to host malicious, applications, etc., that could potentially infect? And then it takes that contextual decision to whether or not allow or block that particular access. Data, of course, is an extension of your data classification and a data prevention policy, and that is possible too. So the beauty is all of these three things coming together to be able to protect your device, keep your environment clean, keep your cloud services clean. If you're sending in data, it's not going into a wrong place. Sorry, very long answer, but I think it was a very comprehensive question that deserved a long answer to that.
No, the other factor that has been playing, a lot of user mind is, we have this new work from home scenario where people are working from home, they are using their own devices. So can McVision use multiple device characteristics in access policies, be able to differentiate a user's iPhone versus an iPhone provided by the company?
Oh, absolutely. There's already several things that are in place, but increasingly, like we said, over the last 4 months, it has become very easy for organizations to be able to provide access over the internet. The flip side of it is when a device access, imagine I were to just give you an access to you to access your corporate instance over your own personal device, I will not be able to control in a traditional world. What this kind of a service will be able to do is it can actually check for your device posture. It can look at whether or not that is a device that is issued by your organization or if it is issued by somebody else. If it is issued by your organization, does it contain any sensitive data? Is that data going to the location that is authorized by the organization to use? Right? So that's one level of access. So I can have 5, 6 different levels of access that I can take a look at it. If I just extend that same thing to then say that, hey, are you trying to use my corporate instance using a device that you got it for yourself, but I've allowed you to access that because I still need you to do my work. I may still be able to provide a read-only access for you to reach my corporate instance using your personal device, but I can prevent downloads, I can prevent you from posting any of the data back from the device back to my corporate instance of my application. So there's all sorts of that possibility. So you can have a managed to manage, a managed to unmanaged, an unmanaged to manage, and an unmanaged unmanaged. So all of this is possible with these capabilities.
Very interesting, very interesting. There's another thing that most of the corporate CXOs are worried about is the threat levels are increasing. So how does McVision provide consistent data and threat protection?
See, I spoke briefly about what we can see with the McAfee eye, right? So we've got about a billion sensors across the globe. We look at all kinds of threats that are coming in. Every minute we are seeing roughly about 300 different threats that were previously unseen. And all of this is broken down into different forms of data, different attributes and all of that, and stored in our large big data lake, as we call it. It's called this global threat intelligence for us. So that GTI essentially looks at all of this and then determines whether or not that device that is accessing and the service that is actually accessing this is allowed, or if there is something potentially malicious there. So CXOs and CIOs are indeed worried, but there's also that huge investment that's going on from McAfee's side, for example, to keep them safe at all times. And this is what helps us drive and keep corporates around the globe and enterprises around the globe safe and secure at all times.
There's also this point of how MVision is works on malware protection of files and documents that get downloaded into corporate applications all the time, like G Drive, Dropbox, Salesforce, etc. How does it do that?
Again, something that I briefly spoke about. If you can recall that one slide where I spoke about a funnel approach. So every time when you access something over the internet, and right now we're just speaking about that particular thing over the internet, whether you're trying to access it from a cloud service or over the internet, every time you try to download a particular file, a lot of stuff happens before that file actually reaches your endpoint. The first thing is the moment you try to go to that website where you're trying to download a file or you're trying to access a piece of data or a packet of data, the background analysis essentially tells you whether that website is safe enough. If it's got a bad reputation, if it's got previous history of having hosted malicious files, that immediately has a certain reputation, that immediately has a certain set of malware analysis that is already done, and that connection is refused, saying that you can't access this by policy. Assuming that it is still a valid website, but there is a payload that is actually coming through that particular channel, you've got multiple of those engines that you look at it. So it passes through the gateway, the number one thing at the funnel. Then it comes through to the next level of the emulation sandbox that we spoke about, where it is unpacked and tried to see if it is going to behave in a different manner. And finally, we also have that capability to be able to isolate that in that remote browser container that I spoke about before it actually comes to the endpoint. And security still never stops, right? And that's where the beauty of McAfee's device to cloud strategy actually comes in. So even if by any chance that one file out of 10 million opportunities actually reaches your endpoint, you still have McAfee's endpoint protection and endpoint detection and response still on access, be able to identify and tell you that it is a bad file. So rest assured, McAfee has got that covered at the edge, at the device, at both locations.
There are a lot of questions that are just flowing in, and I'm sure, but we seem to be running out of time. I had just one question from my end. We have spoken about the SASE framework, and it has been a very recent one that has, it was envisaged, in fact, last year, and its relevance, we are seeing it right now in a much major way. How do you see the future panning out on this framework, and what do you think will be the roadmap for enterprises to adopt SASE?
SASE is one framework, like I said, it's bringing together networking and network security together to be delivered over the edge. Business often drives decisions, circumstances often drive decisions. So I think we are at that stage in the world where organizations will increasingly adopt such kind of frameworks. It is a framework that is built on an extensible framework, so which means that you could start with one aspect of SASE, you could start with certain corporate applications and provide them access over the internet, and slowly but steadily start extending it to applications that are within your own environment, within your own data center, and then start slowly scaling out. So where I see is there's a big push towards organizations to understand this framework right now. Most organizations will start, particularly on the web application access side of it, because you don't want traffic to come to your data center and then break out to the internet. There's huge cost optimization opportunities there. They'll start with that, but then eventual investments will go on. And SASE is an evolving framework. As we continue to make investments in this, we will identify more and more opportunities to make that much more foolproof. And I'm very excited about the future of SASE, and organizations will take it up, lap it up with a huge degree of interest. That's my bet.
Thank you so much for your time, Vamsi, and I would like to thank all our viewers. In case you have more questions and queries, you can keep posting them, and the experts from our end and McAfee will, definitely take them up. The future, work from home has become a reality which we are going to live for a long time, and in that sense, frameworks like SASE will become very relevant for us, for securing our enterprises and increasing efficiency. In that, with that take, I would like to take your leave and thank everyone.